our godly character and conduct can be a beautiful presentation that provides people with a reflection and image of God. Well, this morning we are continuing in our series, Committed to God. We're in Daniel chapter 6. We're going to look at verses 1 through 17. Title of the message is Excellent Character and Dignified Conduct. And you might have a subtitle in there, Why Does Character and Conduct Matter? As we get into this particular chapter, we have to back up just a little bit. I just want to kind of frame the message for this morning. As we look at Daniel chapter 6, one of the things that we should take note is that first and foremost, remember that Daniel was a man who was deported from his home in Jerusalem to the Babylonian kingdom when he was a young man. The first two kings that he was under when he was in Babylonian captivity was King Nebuchadnezzar and then Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar. Well, last week, as we ended chapter 5 of Daniel, one of the things that we should have noted was that there was a transition in who was ruling at that point in time. And so Babylon was then conquered by the Medo-Persian, the Persian Empire. And the king who was ruling at that time for Persia was a man named Darius. And so we will see that is what we find as we get into Daniel chapter 6, that there is this man Darius who comes to the forefront as the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And so starting out at verse 1 of Daniel chapter 6, as we talk about character and conduct, note what it states. It says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, stationed throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, including Daniel. To these satraps gave account, so that the king might suffer no loss. And so we see here that Darius and really the Medo-Persians, they set up a governmental structure. You can say that that governmental structure is very similar to many of the governments that we would even see in today's society, as we have someone who, in this case, he was a king. And so think about the president, and the president then has, in his office, a vice president and then others. And then within our current government structure, we have those who are in Congress who are then responsible for serving people. And so at this point in time, there were 3 presidents, and under the 3 presidents were 120 satraps, which you might say are more kind of governors who were reporting to the presidents. Daniel was one of the 3 presidents. And so he was very high up within the governmental structure of the Medo-Persians. And the reason they set this governmental structure up was, note, so that the king might suffer no loss. Literally, it says that so the king would suffer no injury. Now, not personal injury, but so that his kingdom would run well. And so that is why they set up this governmental structure. But note again, Daniel was placed in this position of high authority, and yet he is a Jew. He is not even from the Medo-Persian people. That is not his heritage. And yet, God saw fit to place him in that role. And so at verse 3, note, it says this. And soon Daniel distinguished himself above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire or the whole kingdom. And so we can see here that Daniel has distinguished himself. He has outshined the other presidents. And it notes here why. What is it that Daniel has done that makes him look better or distinguishes him from the others? And note, it says this, because he had what? An excellent spirit. And I would say the Spirit of God resided in him. That is why he was distinguished from all the others. See, the Spirit of God is that which moves and provides life and wisdom. It provides longevity. It provides us the knowledge to understand what to do and what not to do in certain situations and circumstances. The Spirit of God provides us power in order for us, God's people, to act. And so Daniel had the Spirit of God so that he could act and do that which was right. One of the things that is needed for God's people today is that we need to be empowered with the Spirit of God so that we know what to do, what not to do, so that we have wisdom and discernment, so we are wise in the way that we move. There was a gentleman that I used to listen to on Christian radio years ago. His name was Hank Hennegrath. And he used to state this, that each and every day that he rose in the morning, he would ask God to empower him for service. I kind of took that on myself. And so every morning I want God to empower me, fill me with his Spirit so that I might serve him and serve others well. And so ultimately we need the empowerment of the Spirit, because it is only with God's Spirit that we can reflect the nature and the character of God and do those things that are right before the Lord. And so I pray that you all would do the same thing, that you would rise in the morning and ask that God would empower you. You know, when you rise in the morning and you go into the bathroom, you know, and getting prepared for the day, and you look in the mirror and you said, oh my gosh, what is that's in the mirror? As you have looked and you see all the crusties in the eyes, and you need to brush your teeth and wash your face and whatever else you need to do to get prepared. But here's the thing, as you look in that mirror, what do you see? You see a reflection of yourself. Well, here's the thing. When you get up and you go about your day, you know, people are not necessarily going to see Jesus in the flesh. However, when they see you, the Christian who is filled with the Spirit of God, hopefully they are seeing a reflection of the nature and the essence and the character of Jesus Christ. I hope they see the imago Dei, or the image of God. Now, again, you are not God, but you are a very reflection of God, a reproduction per se, a likeness of the real thing. And see, each and every day that you go out and you do what you do, whether that's at work, at school, whatever the case might be, you can show and demonstrate God's grace, his mercy, love, kindness, compassion, character, righteousness, and etc. See, you can be all those things, but here's the thing, you are only capable of this reflective nature if you are filled with the Spirit of God. Or as the writer of Daniel states, have an excellent spirit. And because Daniel had an excellent spirit, note, God honored him. God honored Daniel by placing him in a position of power, even within a foreign land and kingdom. And so we see Daniel is distinct. He has distinguished himself. But oftentimes when you distinguish yourself, what happens? The haterade comes about. People hate on those who seem to have elevated themselves or been elevated. And so note what happens at verse 4. And so the presidents and the satraps tried to find grounds for complaint. So the other presidents and the other individuals who were leaders within this governmental structure that was established in the Persian Empire, they start to complain. And so the presidents and the satraps tried to find grounds for complaint against Daniel in connection with the kingdom. But note, they could find no grounds for complaint or any corruption, because Daniel was faithful and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. And so, no, these individuals are trying to find something that Daniel has done wrong, and yet they could find nada, nothing. There was no negligence or corruption. And see, Daniel most likely was one of the few, if not only, Jews appointed to a leadership role within this new kingdom. And because Daniel's Jewish heritage, it is probably why the other leaders sought to undermine his leadership role. But again, they could not find anything. They had nothing that really pointed to something that was corrupt, something that was wrong, or something that would tarnish Daniel's character. Again, remember, it had been noted previously, Daniel had what? An excellent spirit. And that excellent spirit allowed him to be innocent and blameless. There was no corruption or unrighteous activity in Daniel. And see, here's the thing. That's how we should be. When we go to, again, to work, to school, whatever the case might be, we want to be innocent. We want to have nothing that people can point to and say, oh, wait a second. You know what they do is unrighteous. It's not right. You know, they are, wrong in their actions and their activity. No, we want to be blameless. We want to be innocent. We want people to say, listen, no matter what has happened, whatever the situation or circumstance, they act in a manner that is honorable and right. And so with Daniel here, there was no corruption or unrighteous activity. Thus, his character could not be questioned. They could not, as people would say today, they could not throw dirt on his name because Daniel was right and he was blameless. And see, I can almost guarantee you that Daniel was obedient and he heeded the voice and the command of the Lord. And that's why God blessed him. It reminds me of something that is stated in Exodus chapter 15, verse 26. As God is speaking to Moses and Moses is leading the nation of Israel, God tells Moses, listen, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give heed to his commandments and keep his statutes, there is a blessing awaiting you. And see, I think that was Daniel. Daniel heeded God's word. He listened carefully. He did what was right. He kept the statutes of God, and therefore God honored him and blessed him. And because Daniel listened to the Lord and did what the Lord desired and lived in a manner that pleased God, again, this led to the Lord blessing Daniel. Now, mind you, Daniel is where again? He's in a foreign land. He's not in Jerusalem. He's not back home. He hasn't been home since he was a young man. Yet Daniel trusted God in his circumstances. And the Lord in turn honored Daniel's attitude and activities by elevating him within the kingdom. And see, this is a time-tested truth and an example for us. Not that, listen, we're not doing things solely so the Lord can bless us, but if we do what God has told us to do based upon his word, we will see the hand of the Lord in our daily lives. We will see the hand of the Lord in our family, in our situations, in our circumstances. And so Daniel is providing us a template, a blueprint on how we should live our lives. Even if we're in situations that don't seem perfect, outside of the norm, maybe even situations where we don't necessarily want to be in. But Daniel said, listen, I am going to honor the Lord. I'm going to serve him. I am going to do what he has called me to do, even in situations and circumstances that I don't want to necessarily be in, but I'm still going to do what God has called me to do. And if I do that, God will bless me. And so at verse 5, note, the men who were in the elevated positions in government, the other presidents and the satraps, it states this at verse 5. Then the men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. And so the leaders knew they could not find anything that they could bring into question Daniel's character. And so what they did was they contemplated upon the one thing that they thought they could use against Daniel, his relationship with the Lord. And see, it is apparent that Daniel continued to worship God in spirit and truth, despite his situation, circumstance, and his location. You think about, as we've gone through, we're into Daniel chapter 6, but let me take you back to Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, it states this, that God granted Daniel favor before the Babylonian officials. In Daniel chapter 2, it states this, that Daniel and his companions, and you think about the other 3 Hebrew boys who were deported with him. You know, the Babylonians named them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But those other 3 boys that went with him, it states this in Daniel chapter 2, that they sought the mercy of God as Nebuchadnezzar asked for an interpretation to his dream. And so Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys, they go before the Lord and ask the Lord to provide them the interpretation to this dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And God provided the interpretation. And it states this, after that, Daniel blessed God. Later on in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel testified before the king about the God who reveals mysteries. And then Nebuchadnezzar, after the interpretation of the dream by Daniel, he acknowledged that Daniel's God is the God of gods. And then later on in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar references the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That was their Jewish names, or their Jewish names. And once again, in chapter 5, the government officials in chapter 6, this chapter here, the government officials understand and they acknowledge the relationship between Daniel and his God. And so we see that Daniel has been consistent in his relationship with the Lord, with his serving and honoring the Lord, in submitting his life unto the Lord. There has been consistency. And so we see that Daniel has continued to worship God in spirit and truth despite his circumstances and his location. And see, when you have submitted your life to the Lord, when you are walking with God, people might not like it, but here's the thing, they will know where you stand and they will understand the relationship you have with God. And yes, it is great that people know you walk with the Lord, but more importantly, as the people of God, our priority should be a desire to seek God, testify about God, to have a deep, intimate relationship with God. That should be our number one priority. And then if people see that and they reflect upon it and they understand that, that's great. But most importantly, we need to prioritize our desire to seek God day in and day out. Now, sometimes that might hurt people. Sometimes that might lead people to plot against you, as we see here. But that is okay, because God will be with you at all times, like he was with Daniel and his friends. And so Daniel's relationship with the Lord was the one thing that the governmental leaders thought they could capitalize upon to provoke Darius, the Persian king, to possibly condemn Daniel. And so at verse 6, note, it says this, and so the presidents and the satraps conspired and came to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. Verse 7, and all the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an interdict that whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. And so, as we see here, again, the presidents and the satraps and the counselors, these government officials, they could not bring anything against Daniel, and so they tried to undermine Daniel with a trap. They are conniving a way so that they can get Daniel. Now, here's the first issue with this. The very first issue is this. Not all of the government officials believed in the need to establish this ordinance that no one could pray to any other god except to pray unto Darius. I guarantee you that these presidents and these satraps did not consult with Daniel about this proposed ordinance. Thus, there was not 100% agreement. And so we can see the unrighteousness of these individuals. The second issue is this. The government officials are knowingly, unrighteously setting a trap for Daniel. They know he's a man of prayer and that he prays to the Most High God. Thus, he will automatically break this proposed ordinance, which bans praying to God. They knew this, but they still were trying to figure out a way to trap Daniel. The third issue is this. These individuals, opposite of Daniel, are not people of integrity. I wouldn't say these individuals are individuals who have high moral character. See, they are misusing their position, not telling the entire truth in order to entice the king to act in a way that harms Daniel. But the fourth thing, which is probably the worst thing, is this, that they are trying to establish a law that prevents someone, and even if it's just one individual, but they are trying to prevent someone from giving honor and reverence to the Lord. Now, we have spoken about the character and conduct of Daniel being excellent. But now on the flip side, we are seeing or being provided the example of poor character and conduct by these government officials. And as I was going through and preparing this message, I started to think about just even in our current society, our current culture. Right now, we're getting close to election season, and we need to, all of us, all of those who are voting for our elected officials, we need to keep these first 8 verses top of mind. That as we are voting for our elected officials, here's the thing. Character and conduct matters. It still matters. We could see hashtag character and conduct matters. And that's the thing. We need to keep that top of mind. And so, at verse 9, note what happens. Now the king, Darius, gets involved. And it says this, therefore King Darius, he signed the document and the interdict. And see, here's the thing. King Darius should have, before he signed this ordinance into law, he should have taken the time to truly understand what was going on. But instead, he takes the information from his leadership and he takes it for granted. And so he just signs away. But he should have asked more questions. He should have determined why this law was necessary. But unfortunately, he received one-sided information. He introduced or signed it into law. And this is something that he ultimately would regret. And so at verse 10, it says this. Now, Daniel knew the document had been signed. Yet he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room, open toward Jerusalem, to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. And so we see again the righteousness, the righteous character of Daniel. Daniel continued to worship the Lord. It's amazing to me as I think about Daniel and his situation. Remember, he's been taken from his home. He was deported as a young man. Now, he knew the Lord as a young man, but you would think, oftentimes when people are placed in situations, they disregard what God has done for them. They think, well, God doesn't, think about me any longer. He doesn't care about my situation or my circumstances. He's allowed me to be put in this bad place. Therefore, I'm going to disregard the Lord. But that's not what Daniel did. Daniel still continued to trust in God, even despite the circumstances that he found himself in. And so he continued to pray to the Lord and to praise him as he had done previously. And so we see again the righteousness of Daniel. He had realized that the king had signed this no prayer to God statute. It was now a kingdom ordinance. However, Daniel maintained his practice of prayer 3 times a day as his way of honoring and praising the Lord. Hey, this is a perfect example for all of us. A perfect example of what we should be doing, how we should be living our lives. Listen, prayer is our way of communing to the Lord. Prayer is not about us getting our wish list, but it's our way of communing to the Lord and then receiving from the Lord on how we should continue to live our lives. And so Daniel is taking the time to maintain his communion with God 3 times a day. It was his way of honoring and praising the Lord. But here's the thing. There's some tension in this situation. And as we're thinking about this, think about what this means even for us today. There's something that has been signed into law. It is law of the land. You cannot pray unto God. But yet, there is this desire to continue to serve the Lord and to serve the Lord well, to honor him. And so the question that should be in our minds as Christians is, how should we, or this a question that comes up is, how should we as Christians operate when it comes to government and God, especially when the government contradicts the word of God? And see, Daniel is giving us an example here, but Jesus provided us an example. The epistles provide us an example. And so you think about what Jesus stated. If you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, there was a time when someone came up to Jesus and said, hey, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus responded, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and render to God the things that are God. And what Jesus was ultimately saying is this. Listen, Rome is the ruler of the world at this point. It is the kingdom. It is the empire. And so those things that have been established and have been divinely established, yes, we should fall in line. So just as today, when you go out and you get in your car and you're driving down the street, you will see street signs that say stop or the speed limit. And just because you're a Christian and it does not give you the right to just say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to take note of the laws of this land. No, we need to follow the laws of this land, but we also need to follow the laws and the precepts of God as well. And so that's why Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar and render to God the things that are God. In Romans chapter 13, Paul addresses this as well. In 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 2, again, Paul notes this, and then Peter notes it in his epistle in 1 Peter chapter 2. And what each of those individuals do is they note the idea of subjecting oneself to government and the divinely willed order of society, thus following the laws of the land. But they also note the importance of following God. And see, typically the laws of the land do not necessarily directly conflict with the law of God. However, when we look at the priority and the higher authority, the biblical text seems to be very, very clear that we, Christians, are called to obey the Lord. And note in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, this mandate, that we must obey God rather than whom? Than men. And thus, Daniel, as we look back at him in this situation, Daniel has followed the greater good, which is honoring the Lord instead of honoring man. And so at verse 11, note, it goes on further and states this. And the conspirators came and they found Daniel praying. And so these individuals know Daniel's schedule, in essence. They know that he prays 3 times a day. They know the framework in which he is going to pray. They know he's going to go into the upper room. The windows are open. He is praying towards Jerusalem. They knew it. You know, I can imagine if it was today, somebody would take out their camera and they would be filming so that they could post it on social media. And so the conspirators, they came at verse 11 and found Daniel praying, seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to anyone, divine or human, within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions? And the king answered and responded, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. And so these individuals who are spying on Daniel, they are now snitching on Daniel. So in today's society, a snitch is what? That's a bad word. You know, when you're a snitch, that means you are telling something that you should not be telling. I remember growing up, we used to call those who went to like your parents or people in authority to get you in trouble. We used to call those people what? Tattletales. You know, you didn't want to be a tattletale. I remember my kids when they were younger, especially my 2 older ones, you know, if they came to one of us, my wife or myself, and they were telling on each other, one of them was like, man, you're a tattletale. And so you don't want to be a tattletale, but that's what these individuals are. They are snitches. They are telling on Daniel. They're telling about what he does in his own private home. And so Daniel is in the privacy of his own home. He's praying, and yet they have spied on him, and then they go and confirm with the king about the ordinance. Why? So that they can indict Daniel. And so at verse 13, they respond to the king and say, then they responded to the king at verse 13, Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the interdict that you have signed, but he is saying his prayers 3 times a day. Verse 14, and when the king heard the charge, note, he was very much distressed. He was determined to save Daniel. Until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. And so these presidents and satraps, they come and they say, listen, Daniel is breaking your law. And once the king heard this, again, it states he became distressed. I bet you when he received the news, he thought to himself, oh boy, I have messed up at this point in time. And see, when the king hears that the new ordinance will affect Daniel, he realizes what is happening. And so he tries his best to deliver Daniel. But at verse 15, it says this, then the conspirators came to the king and said to him, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians, that no interdict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Verse 16, then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you. Verse 17, a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his Lord, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. And so the law of Darius was confirmed, and it was deemed unchangeable. Daniel was put into this position of certain death. At least that was the thought. But Darius, as he is condemning Daniel, Darius is hoping and praying himself that Daniel's God would save Daniel from death. Now, I don't know about you, but this scene is reminiscent and closely associated with another biblical story, the burial of Jesus Christ. You think about it. After Christ's death, he was buried in a tomb. And in similar fashion to Daniel, a stone was laid at the mouth of the tomb to seal it. And with the sealing, you think about the followers of Jesus Christ, the disciples and others. When he was sealed in his tomb, that sealed their hopes and dreams. Yet Christ overcame death and the tomb, and with his victory, he provided further hope to many. Well, going back to Daniel, the government officials who assisted in placing Daniel in this so-called tomb or the den of lions, they believed he would die and not survive. And with his death, they would be rid of this God follower. See, with Daniel's death, they would no longer have to be compared with this man of godly character, this man with this excellent spirit, the one who was highly favored and distinguished. They would no longer be compared to that with his death. And with Daniel's death and demise, it would open the door for their exaltation, or at least that's what they thought would be the case. Now, there's more to the story. I'm not going to spoil the end because we will finish up the back half of chapter 6 next week. So there's no spoiler alert here. But what I want to do is this. I want us to understand why it is so important to be people of excellent character and dignified conduct, like Daniel. See, here's the thing. We cannot always control situations and circumstances. I know we would like to. I think sometimes we think we can, but we cannot control our situations and circumstances. But the one thing we can control is our conduct and our character. We can control how we present ourselves. That is completely in our control. We have the autonomy to exhibit good character and conduct. Or vice versa, we can exhibit bad character and conduct. And see, our character is the one thing that is on exhibition each and every day. You think about it, when you go out to a meal, last week, my family and I, we went to the sushi restaurant. And when they bring out the meal, I mean, it is beautiful. I mean, the presentation is beautiful, and people are taking out their phones and taking pictures because of how beautiful it is. Or you think about like a flower arrangement, or if you go to a reception, and the presentation matters. And when it's arranged well and presented with excellence, it is beautiful. Our godly character and conduct can be a beautiful presentation that provides people with a reflection and image of God. And see, that's what Daniel did. And he did it every day. He lived it. But the question is, for us, how about you? How about me? Is our conduct and our character beautiful? Do we present ourselves well each and every day so that we can honor the Lord? Will you live out Christ daily, no matter the circumstances, like Daniel? And see, my prayer is that you will, that I will, that he will empower us, that he would fill us. That God will fill us with his Spirit so we can exhibit excellent character and dignified conduct. And so that's the example. That's the template, the blueprint that is demonstrated today. Excellent character and dignified conduct comes from the Lord. We need to be empowered by the Lord. But that's what he desires so that people can see him through us.